You guys want to walk it?
Sure, let's go walk them out.
Hit the lightning, boys. Hit the lightning. 2, 3. Why do we have to do that other one?
Right, Roger.
Well, there's a feeling that in the Green Mile, that the human spirit is alive and well even under the most difficult circumstances. And I think sometimes the more difficult that life becomes, the more the human spirit has a chance to shine.
It's not the kind of story that people immediately think of when you hear Stephen King mentioned. It didn't have the fur and the fangs and the haunted cars, but it had this really rich world that it presented that struck me as very, in the best sense, old-fashioned.
I find it an amazing story about the triumph of loving kindness, and in a place where it's not, you know, the rule of the day. I mean, it's death row.
Frank Darabont jokes and says that he has the world's smallest specialty, that he only makes Stephen King prison movies that are set in the past.
My interest in it really sprang from a very preliminary conversation I had with Steve King on the phone one day. And he told me of this idea that he'd been kicking around, the concept of the Green Mile, which really didn't amount to more than a 30-second description of the story overall. I found it intriguing enough that I asked him to reserve me a place at the head of the line if he ever actually got around to writing it.
We were speculating about a serial novel idea, which Charles Dickens used to do. And when I finally sat down and started working on it, I thought, if I put myself in a situation where I absolutely have to write this, if I promise people an installment a month for X numbers of months, it'll probably get written.
And so I received this thing in the mail one day, and I read it. I had no idea where the story was going to go.
I thought to myself, I have made the biggest mistake in my life. This thing is going to die in the streets.
I was just floored by it. I thought I had yet to read the last 5 books. In fact, he had yet to write the last book. And yet, based on that first book and based on the sort of brief, sketchy description of his idea overall that he'd given me on the phone prior to that, I thought, okay, I've got to remind him that I'm first in line here, because I really want this. It felt like that Stephen King that I really, really love, that humanistic writer that he is. It felt like it was the same writing muscle he was flexing that spawned Shawshank.
This is what Stephen King does so well. He somehow is able to really create these characters that are flawed but good by and large. We usually throw around the names, you know, Stephen King, and you think you're going to be getting this very particular kind of brand of a horror story, and this is really not.
It's a tapestry, and it's only by the interweaving of all the stories and all the dynamics that by the end of the film, as you separate from it, you begin to see the pattern.
First of all, Frank's script for The Green Mile is the best film adaptation that I've ever read, hands down.
Which is a comment I treasure. I really want to do right by him. I really want to do right by a story that I love that much, that I think is that good.
It's the best adaptation of a screenplay that I've ever read, certainly one that I've ever been involved in.
I'm very blessed because when I came into this project, not only was there a screenplay that nothing should be touched, not a period, a comma, no word should be deleted. It was absolutely like the Holy Grail. But Frank had already had a relationship with Tom.
while I was writing the script, Tom simply came into my head and wouldn't go away. Not that I wanted him to, because he seemed like such a marvelous fit. I tried to say, look, Tom, just give me a minute. Just let me finish the script first. But there he was in my head going, I'm Paul Edgecombe, I'm Paul Edgecombe.
You know, you're always looking for something that is unexplainable, you know, and there it is, sort of like lightning in a bottle.
Here we go, guys. This will be pictured.
Here, the logic of Paul Edgecombe was absolutely, it was set in stone from the very beginning.
Why Tom? Well, I'm not sure why Tom.
Please help us finish what we started.
I can't explain it. It kind of lands not in the brain, but here in the gut, you know, in the heart.
Why do you get a man like Tom Hanks to say yes to a project? Because the material has integrity. The material speaks for itself. Once you have Tom Hanks, you have your linchpin. You have the anchor to the show.
Great. Let's both check the gate, please.
Certainly he's the central character, but he's got contradictions and conflicts happening with so many different characters in the piece that it's, you know, it makes for great drama.
He's truly a funny and talented man. You know, there's been so many times where we haven't even had to say a joke. He'll just look at me a certain way, something's happening in a scene, and we're gone.
There are a number of people there who really, you could see, this is something special. And Doug Hutchinson was one, and Sam Rockwell was another. Those two guys really stood out.
One of my concerns really was that here I am, I finally get this juicy role in this amazing film, and I'm playing the shithole of the piece. And they're all gonna be like part of this club over here, and I'm gonna be over here, like sulking, you know? Tom Hanks, David Morse, they welcomed me with open arms, and we've become really like a tight little club during this whole thing. It's my mama's dream. Yeah. She wished she had this apparatus when I was a little boy.
The biggest question I had, and the biggest question I think we both had in the first 2 or 3 months of working together, was who was going to play John Coffey?
Ah, the hunt for John Coffey. Oh, yes. I know we were in great shape with Tom, but unless we found the right John Coffey, I don't know how this movie would have turned out.
In the search for the right John Coffey, we didn't want to rule out anybody. We really had no ideas.
And Michael came sort of out of left field.
Bruce Willis was the main person that first told me about the Green Mile. He said, Michael, they're going to be making a movie about this dude named John Coffey. He said, I'm going to call Frank Darabont and tell him that I found John Coffey.
And Michael came in and read for us.
I ate, slept, used the bathroom, almost showered with that script. There wasn't anything going to stop me from bringing John Coffey to life the way I wanted to.
Michael's screen test was amazing. But not as amazing as the performance that he eventually laid down day to day on the set. That essence that is a part of Michael Clark Duncan somewhere in him is John Coffey.
I think it was only about 3 weeks before principal photography that we actually made the deal with Michael.
And he said, you know what, you got the job. I hollered, I went, yeah! I hung up on my agent right away, and I called my mother. I said, Mom, we'll be working with Tom Hanks. We started crying over, oh, we'll be working with Tom Hanks.
Yeah, you know, in table readings, everybody's kind of like they're like dogs, and they're kind of sniffing each other out. They're kind of, you know, they're checking. All the actors are kind of seeing what's going to happen. They're waiting, you know, and who's going to be the one who's going to burst the bubble, you know. And Michael Clark Duncan was the one. He just went in there and he just started doing the whole thing, man. He was blowing when he healed the mouse. He was healing the mouse. He was just doing a whole thing, and everybody was kind of like, wow, all right. Let's do it. Let's go. Let's turn on the juice. Let's wave the flags, man. Yeah!
hushing.
It's a great group of people. You're in a company of actors in which everybody has something good to do.
My cast just really touched me very deeply, performing their jobs and caring so much, and really just doing it for the love of the film, doing it for the love of one another as well.
Frank Darabont has no life. This is it. His life is one long death row experience.
The best part of working with Frank is watching him watch the monitor, because he looks like a little, like, cherubic, excited boy watching something.
Frank is discussing whether or not he has enough of the shot. He's talking with David Tattersall, the director of photography, hoping against hope. He's got everything he needs. Let's watch.
So I think what we ought to do is get the reverse on the floor. And the reverse on the desk.
And that's the magic of Frank.
Believe me, I don't have a full understanding of his process at all. But I do know this is a terribly gifted person who is running an awful lot on his gut and his moment-to-moment concentration, and his mind feeding it the whole time. That brilliant brain of his.
And now in this scene, I want you to burst into flames.
Frank's not only trying to do service to his script, Frank's also trying to do service to Stephen King's creation.
Our sets.
It was really quite breathtaking to walk down the mile for the first time and see what an incredible job they'd done of recreating this, this death row E-block penitentiary. It was incredible.
How's this for a set? I love this.
You know what? It's really fun. I mean, it's really one of the great added bonuses. And on top of that, it's all guys, so you don't have to watch what you say, you know.
Hey, get back in your jail cell. Come on.
Jailbreak. Look how gorgeous he's made.
Tomorrow, we have Stephen King visiting the set of The Green Mile, which will be very cool. We do have a secret evil plan for Stephen King. Since last Monday was his birthday, we're going to spring a birthday cake on him.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Stephen.
He was really floored by the incredible care that Terrence Marsh had put into designing this thing.
Is this the mile the way you pictured it?
Yeah. Sure it is. Yeah.
We've gotten that from a lot of people. They walk in and they go, oh my God, this is exactly what I saw.
It's like walking inside your own head. Yeah. Frank took me around the corner and said, I want to introduce you to a friend of yours. Here's old Sparky.
And then we strap the ankles.
Yeah. Strap the hands.
Strap the hands. You got the braces on the elbows.
Of course, I did what anybody wants to do when they see it. I said, strap me in it. Frank, could I get out now?
What's it worth to you, buddy?
How about the next 3 books? Your pick. And once you get in it, you say to yourself, oh boy, this is like being too far in my own head.
I think one of the biggest things that we never took into consideration was the fact that when you do a prison movie and you create that environment of death row and you force a crew and a cast of actors to go into that environment day after day after day, that pretty soon it starts to bleed you of your energy. You feel like you're on death row.
It's like life is truly imitating art.
Mr. Jingles is the last living, breathing entity with which Dell has or feels a closeness. And it was not at all hard to imagine, the kind of anguish that one experiences when having to let go of those last things to which we cling.
I was hoping we can get as much done with a live mouse as possible. And indeed, that's the way it turned out. We had a troupe of little furry actors. I think we had about 24 mice.
Trying to figure out what motivates a mouse. Those were the biggest challenges, is giving him a personality that the audience would fall in love with.
And it's very easy to fall in love with the animal because he is really, really adorable. There's a definite personality to him, and that's great, you know, for me to have that opportunity to flesh out a key character in a film.
They're really great little mice.
Three's up.
Oh, wow. Wow.
There are times when you can get, or I can get a sense that it's going to fulfill what I imagined in the script. Sometimes it's really hard when you get in here and you're doing the work. But there are some moments.
And cut it!
The image that I think may live with me for a long time was the first time we came running across the river and being followed by the posse. And it was the first time that John Coffey howled.
John Coffey's holding these two dead girls. And he's holding them, he's crying because he feels their pain and what they went through. And these guys, these guys that are tracking Coffey, chasing him, this posse of all these white people, it's like 50 of them. They're on horses, they got dogs, they got pitchforks, shotguns, and they're coming toward John Coffey. And I knew that this was acting, but every take of that scene, I was scared to death.
Good? Yeah, we've got. Great. Let's set to the choker in the down position.
In my mind, man, it was real. It was actually real, and those guys scared me on every single take.
"15, 20 years from now, what will I remember? What memory will I have?"
And watch what you're doing.
There was one thing, and I'll never forget this. And when Hanks was playing a scene with Michael Duncan,
where Paul goes to Coffey and says, "What do you want me to do?"
"You tell me."
And that's one of those scenes that really got me when I read the script.
Probably the heart of the movie is in that scene. Mind you, Michael was not our most experienced actor. But in that scene, as we're shooting it, and I'm on Michael first, and I'm realizing I'm getting distracted by Hanks, who's off camera, just giving him his lines. Hanks is delivering an Academy Award winning performance off camera for Michael Duncan. To give that actor, who has less experience than many of the people in the cast, to give him every possible thing he needs or can use to deliver the best possible performance. I've never seen anything quite so smart and generous as what I saw Tom doing that day.
What am I going to say? That it was my job.
Tom gives you so much energy off camera. I mean, just like you are Tom Hanks and I'm in my crying scene, I look at Tom, his face is full of tears.
Watching that scene the other day, I could see this is it. This is what I read. It was both of them were just so pure and simple and really touching.
Meatloaf be nice.
I was so struck by his wisdom and his generosity in doing what he did, and really being willing to, to maybe not have enough left over for himself when the camera was on him. He wanted Michael to do so well. He wanted him to look so good. I'll never forget that. That was amazing.
Everything had its purpose in this movie. There was a lot of emotion, but you knew it was for the best. It was like giving your all for a team, man. It was like sacrificing your body for the good of everything.
The symbology of the Green Mile is larger than any explanation of it.
I think coffee, to me, represents those extraordinary, visionary souls that come along in human history from time to time that the rest of us feel compelled to exterminate.
John Coffey stands for everything that's right in the world. You know, like if you see an old lady crossing the street and you go over to help her, to me, that's John Coffey. John Coffey stands for everything that is good about the earth.
I've always found it extraordinary that we just can't seem to accept the message of peace and love. You know, it's not such a crackpot notion, but whenever somebody comes along who embodies that notion, we have to nail them to a cross, we have to shoot them, we have to kill them.
We continue, which is what John Coffey says. They kill each other with their love. We continue to kill each other because we fail to recognize that all of us have the demon, and that the only way to deal with that demon is with love and with compassion and with understanding.
Roll on two.
It's been the most difficult emotional work I've ever had to do professionally. You know, because you're playing people who are dealing with last things, the very last things they're ever going to be dealing with. And yeah, it's funny because it's all just make-believe. You know, we're all just pretending anyway. You know, but at the moment that you're doing it, no, it's not funny. It feels real.
Should I kill the Jews? Roll! Roll, for Christ's sake, roll!
Everybody stepped up to the table and delivered, and I think we're going to see a film that will stand the test of time when The Green Mile comes out.
It's been a gift, a wonderful gift.
Tell them what and confess to the crime. I try to have the best time that I can and do the best work that I can, and then it's in the hands of the director, and you hope that then when the story's told, you get the same feeling you did when you read the script and you took the job. Yeah. And if that's the feeling, I think people are going to be really moved by the film.
This is the best type of movie to make, in all honesty. It's that great mystery. It's that great, it's that great injection of, you'll never believe what happened here. You know, the thing that you always hope is that the audience is going to be surprised by what they see. By and large, that's what I'm trying to do every time we make a movie. Look, you think you know what you're going to see. Come on in, because you're going to see that, but you're going to see a bunch of other stuff as well.
The way everything fell together is like a dream come true.
I love those kinds of stories that really take me on a journey. You don't just watch it, you become part of it, you become absorbed in it, you become a participant on that journey. To me, those are the most exciting films. And those are the kinds of films that I aspire to make.
We each go to death. There are no exceptions. But sometimes, oh God, the Green Mile is so long.
Stephen King is bigger as a single brand name than any of the genres he's worked in, mostly the horror genre. I suspect he outsells the entire rest of the genre simply because he is Stephen King. He is a genre unto himself.
Steve kind of spearheaded this new approach in horror fiction that put the horror next door
And suddenly, instead of reading about Victorian ghost stories or werewolves or vampires, King was actually writing stories for people in the 1970s that they could relate to, they could recognize. And certainly that's how he got his audience straight away. I mean, it wasn't like he had to build his audience. They were almost there from Carrie onwards.
I've read every word, I think, that Stephen King has written and published, and I really believe that he is the modern equivalent of Mark Twain or Charles Dickens.
What I found in him that most chimed with me was a way of writing about the materials of horror that didn't treat it in conventional ways, that instead honored it.
Most of the Stephen King stuff I've read has been his real epic stuff. I've read The Green Mile, of course, but you read like The Stand or the most recent Hearts in Atlantis. It's really he throws deep. You know, there's a lot of Hail Mary passes, but man, it seems like he always connects on them, and you're always in the hands of someone who is just the best storyteller around the campfire.
Stephen King is probably the most important popular novelist of the last 50 years or whatever, isn't he? And he admits that he stands on the shoulders of giants. Yeah, and I think we have to say in his case that the giants he particularly stands on the shoulders of are Richard Matheson and Robert Bloch in horror. But I mean, there's a lot of John D. MacDonald in there as well, isn't he? Even Grace Metalius of Peyton Place fame. Yeah, I think he took the idea of popular genre fiction and said, and it doesn't have to be rubbish.
One of the things I think is most compelling about Steve as a writer and as a human being is that he tends to promote a kind of very accessible, conversational, sometimes folksy approach to what he writes.
Steve's style was self-invented. It was sort of rough-hewn. It was easy to parody. Because it was filled with italics. It was filled with, there were exclamation points. Sometimes it was filled with caps. And every now and then you had a line that was all caps in italics with exclamation points. He was not afraid of being unsubtle.
As to what defines a Stephen King book, I would find it very hard to say because he's worked in so many genres over the last 20 or 30 years. And again, I think that's one of his great strengths. He's never really stayed in the same genre, although they all tend to have horror or fantasy or even science fiction involved. I mean, he's still a genre author for whatever that means. But he's been very brave. He's tried different things and sometimes he's failed at doing them, but at least he's had a go. And so I think by always keeping his audience a little off balance, a little off guard, he's been able to keep them with him and take them with him.
He took the scary furniture of the traditional horror story and kind of moved it into a very familiar, sometimes suburban, definitely ordinary people flavored setting.
There are a few pieces of fiction that predate Steve doing this. I Am Legend, for example, Richard Matheson took, which is a very seminal work in horror fiction. And if you've not read it, you owe it to yourselves to read this because it's quite wonderful. But it takes horror and renders it unexotic and puts it next door, thus making it a hell of a lot scarier. And I know that Steve, when he was young, was very much influenced by Richard Matheson, has said so himself. So Steve didn't invent that, but he certainly brought it into the mainstream.
The interesting thing is that good horror fiction has to be grounded in some kind of reality. If it's not, it's fantasy fiction. It's set on other planets, it's set in other worlds, there's dragons, there's elves, there's fairies. With horror fiction, to work on an audience, either as a viewer or as a reader, you need to have some kind of frame of reference. That tends to be the contemporary world we live in. And I think that's one of the great strengths of King. Everything is exactly as you expect, small town USA, and then he will take one element of that and just put a slight twist on it to begin with, and it slowly begins to unravel and affect what goes on around it.
No, his characters tend to be unremarkable people. They're not Van Helsing, vampire killer. You know, they're the people that we know. You know, they're perhaps us. They're unremarkable people until something truly remarkable comes into their lives that turns their lives upside down and challenges them. And then, as individuals, they have to become remarkable. That's really one of the best traditions, I think, in storytelling.
I think it's very interesting that in a lot of horror fiction, we tend to relate more to the villains than we do to the heroes. The opposite is true in King. I always think that you actually relate much better to the heroes and his main protagonists than you ever do to his slightly crazier monsters or the madman in King's work. And I think that's one of his great strengths as a writer. He puts you into the picture, so you feel like you're not reading about these characters, you are these characters.
He knew how human beings thought. He knew why people did the things they did. He understood from observation and from looking within that people very often do things for reasons that they themselves did not understand. When you see that operating in fiction, you're in a higher realm right away. You are dealing with serious writing. It's almost never seen in genre fiction.
All of Stephen's stories are about accessing our fears in a way that is understandable. That is, he brings into our world as we recognize it all our deepest fears and gives them some physical manifestation usually, you know. Everybody has anxiety. You can't live in our culture and not have anxieties, and certainly in our world today. And Stephen has always been absolutely available to those fears and found a way to dramatize them, you know. And Dreamcatcher is the same way, which is what is it that's out there, what's in the dark, what could get into us that would change us, you know. Those are our big fears.
He has a phenomenal sense of story, and of course he's famous for scaring people. The thing is, if you look at the Stephen King films, most of the good ones aren't scary movies at all. You go through this stuff and you say, oh yeah, Stephen King, Shawshank Redemption, a bunch of kids and Stand By Me. The thing about King is he's gotten hammered for having people come out of the walls and go boo. That's not what he does. He's a brilliant, brilliant stylist.
He's a consummate storyteller. He can sit down and just tell you a story. It's like a one-to-one basis. He'll be sitting here in a bar and say, hey, want to hear about the girl with telekinetic powers who could actually, kill everybody at the prom? And you go, yeah, that sounds cool. And suddenly you realize you're 300 pages into the book and you're at the end of it. And that's what is great about King's work. He just sucks you in. He tells you this story in a kind of folksy, interesting, yet literate way. And at the end of it, you come out the other end and go, holy shit, that was cool.
In collaboration, particularly with Peter Straub, the challenges that somebody like Steve would face in collaboration are the challenges you would face in any collaboration, which is that how do you enter into this creative marriage without getting to a creative divorce before the project is finished?
It's a collaborator style that didn't actually sound like either one of us except in little flashes. As it went on, we were writing with obsessive attention to detail, and we were not allowing anything to go undescribed or untouched. Every little bit that could have been 3 sentences long was 10 sentences long. So at least a year and a half was spent with us batting these things back and forth. I learned how absolutely reliable Steve King is, how inventive, also how tactful, because there are certain things I did that he probably didn't like all that much, but he was never less than completely supportive. And so part of the ping pong was actually hardball, because we were trying to unhorse our opponent or our collaborator, and to make him understand how good we were. And we really barreled through to the ending, about the last 100 pages. We reached the last sentence. I wrote the last sentence. And Steve looked at it and said, hold on a second. And then he opened it up and he put in this little rift, this little seam that went on and on and on. And he put another one in at the back half of the sentence. And he made the sentence about 1,000,000 times more beautiful. And it was one of the best experiences of my life. Writing is not collaborative. People who write novels are not natural collaborators at all. This was intensely shared. sentence by sentence. It was a great privilege, and I was moved to the bottom of my soul. I moved to the core by what I saw happening during this process.
He called one day and said, in about 1.5 to 2 years, they're going to publish the unabridged version of The Stand, and I would like you to do the illustrations. I picked the images. He gave me absolute, complete freedom. I think he even said to me at one point, "You're an artist, you know what you're doing." He said, "I'm a writer, so you don't tell me how to write, I won't tell you how to draw." And for about 1.5 years, it was a great feeling knowing that I had about 500 manuscript pages by Stephen King that no one else had seen, and all my friends were clamoring for it, "Oh, what's it about? What's it about? Can I read it?" No.
I can't think of anybody else like him. First of all, 35 years, this incredible fertility. I don't know how he does it. I'm a huge admirer. And one of the things about him, we've had a few meals, etc. He is wildly modest. You don't know it's Stephen King. Tell you a great Stephen King story. We had a sneak of misery. There's a scene at the end of the movie where the evil Annie Wilkes, Jimmy Kahn is crippled and she has a gun in her apron and she comes down with some food for him, and she has not good things in mind for him. And King is sitting there and he's all hunched over, and she comes in and he's saying to himself, "Look out, don't trust her. She's got a gun in her apron."
I think one of the reasons Steve's work is so adaptable to film is that it's written cinematically in the first place. When you're reading a novel, essentially you're making a little movie in your head, and he manages that visualization very, very well for a huge number of people. So in a way, it only seems natural that so many of those projects would go into film.
I mean, there's an absolute correlation between King and King's books and King's movies, because it seems that the books were either bought immediately after they were published, or even before they were published in some cases. Certainly Carrie, which again, as I said before, began almost as a very small book under the radar. It got bought within the same year it came out in publication, was made into a film and became a huge box office film. So at that point, of course, everybody's looking for the next Stephen King book, the next Stephen King story. And so he's been very lucky in that regard, that basically he's been able to sell or pitch material very early on in the writing stage. And so what happens, of course, is the audience will read the novel and they can go and see the film a few months later. And this has made a huge difference to the way I think his career has taken off over the years. And it's a very different way of working. Often it takes years and years and years for a book to get into production in Hollywood. But with Stephen King, it seems to have happened almost overnight, literally in some cases. With many of the books that were bought before they were even published as books, the films were already in pre-production or in production as the book was coming out. And that's an enviable position for any author to be in.
Stephen has an uncanny ability to know what are the elements that would make a good movie. And he very often, almost always, his stories have those elements. Whether it's easy or not to translate them, he suggests very powerful visual images. Even though in some ways they're psychological novels, they always have physical manifestations in them, and that's what the movies are about. It's about seeing things you've never seen before, seeing the thing you're most afraid of seeing.
As you get a little older, you hope for a little more depth in the stories that you experience, consequently, I think the adaptations, I feel the adaptations that have been the most successful have been those that have hewn more toward exploring Stephen King's characters. Those films like Stand By Me, The Dead Zone, Misery. These have been the ones that I've enjoyed the most, and I think have been the most Dolores Claiborne, the most successful of the adaptations, because it's really been about what Steve does best, characters.
The thing that people find appealing but don't want to talk about, actually it's the thing that's most explicit in The Green Mile, is the religious side to his stuff. His books are fundamentally about redemption, aren't they? They're all about struggling towards perfection. I don't think King has ever particularly talked about his own religious faith, but it seems to me that something that's throughout all the books. There's a great struggle with not just spirituality, but Christianity specifically. And you have plenty of, there's Carrie's mom and the gutless priest in Salem's Lot. They're not books and stories, films about how great religious people are and how bad irreligious people are. But it seems to me he is always out there struggling with the big themes of spirituality, the big themes of Christianity. And quite a lot of his stories have Messiah figures. There's and the Green Mile has one of the great ones, isn't it? It even has the right initials.
The Green Mile seems so atypical of his work in some ways on the surface of it, but it's not. It's really so him.
I had a wonderful idea for a story which became The Green Mile, but it was also a very difficult story for me to write. And when I finally sat down and started working on it, I thought to myself, left to my own devices, this is probably going to be one where the lazy Stephen King triumphs, and I'm going to find something that's easier to work on, because in a lot of ways, dealing with John Coffey is a difficult thing to do. He's a very tragic character. And I thought, if I put myself in a situation where I absolutely have to write this, if I promise people an installment a month for X numbers of months, it'll probably get written. So serializing it was supposed to be something that drove me along faster, and it actually succeeded better than I thought it would.
It was certainly an artistic risk for Stephen King to do The Green Mile as 6 volumes in that kind of Dickensian serial type novel event way of doing things. But he set himself a challenge, which I think is brilliant for a writer, and his publishers went with that. What I think is just amazing about the whole process was that when the first book was published, he hadn't even written the 6th book in the series yet. For King to be able to sit down and think, okay, where's this story going to go? I've got to tie this up now in 6 volumes. It set himself obviously various parameters, but the fact he pulled it off and pulled it off so superbly, I think is absolutely a testament to his talent. It's a rare thing for an author to, in his position, to challenge themselves in that way. And I think, all the better for King to have tried it and actually succeeded in doing it.
I loved that Green Mile became a mystical piece. I love that it became, without going overboard or even very far with it, it became all about this very beautiful, small idea at the core of this story. And he maintained a perfect balance, I think, in that. Well, it's definitely Steve. It's perhaps the kinder, gentler Steve, because he'll obviously show different facets, of who he is. Every storyteller does.
There was something oddly attractive about working on E Block in The Green Mile. You liked these guys. You wanted to be part of this camaraderie. I mean, you would never imagine that if your job is to get up in the morning and go off and guard killers, and probably about once a month put them to death, execute them. That's not going to be a real pleasant job. But there was something about the way E Block was established and the rules of behavior, in the trust that the guards had for each other and affection that they had for each other, as well as the trust and affection they developed with the inmates themselves, the men that they were going to eventually execute. It was something that was oddly human in a place that should be, and probably is, a very dehumanizing place.
Well, the only thing Green Mile resembles remotely is Rita Hayworth in The Shawshank Redemption, because they're the only 2 stories that I've ever written that had a prison plot. But really, Shawshank and Green Mile are not much alike in that The Shawshank Redemption is a straight story that has to do with friendship and the rebirth of hope, but pretty much it's a straight story. Whereas The Green Mile has more in common with some of the stranger tales that I've written. It's set in a prison, and it's set in the 30s, and it was unlike a lot of my stuff in that I had to research certain aspects of what the capital punishment was like in that period. And I think I got interested in the fact that so many of the executions went wrong in the early days of it. And that struck me as a really sort of macabre idea. And in a lot of ways, Shawshank is a brighter story than this one. This one's kind of a chilly, suspenseful thing.
Well, Steve is obviously a publishing phenomenon, aside from being a really good writer, you know, and a really famous writer. He is just this publishing phenomenon, and has been responsible for blazing a few trails, or reblazing some old trails, actually.
To the question of how Steve changed horror fiction and popular fiction, I think just by, the simple answer is just by combining them in a really accessible way. I think he just had a very deft hand for doing that at that time, and I think that the response of people to his fiction is a reflection of, you know, how skillfully he did that.
In reading his books, it's almost like having him sitting in the living room with you, telling the story. There's something so easy and unforced about his voice. And it doesn't matter if he's writing a horror story or a character study or something with no whiff of another world or monsters or the supernatural in it. You know, it's just great stories well told.
The thing about King was he was really at his best most of the time, and you never knew what it was going to be. You never knew it was going to be scary, or he was just a marvelous writer who I think is just as successful as he should be.
To turn out so much stuff, to be available to so many of the feelings that are floating in the air and turn them into scary, riveting stories. That's hard, and he has done that again and again for, you know, years and years and years. And people sometimes denigrate that thing, you know, it's not fine literature or whatever. It's very hard to do what he does. You just can't be that popular without having a lasting impact. You know, it's just like the Beatles or something. Stephen King is like the Beatles. That's the way it is with popular storytelling. Stephen will be like that forever.
I think Stephen King's legacy is already assured from the books he's already done. I think he has already produced more solid, important material in not only just in the horror field, but in literature, and especially in American literature of the 20th and 21st century, than probably any other writer. So history will remember Stephen King, whatever he does from now on anyway. He's always talking about retiring and giving up writing and whatever, but he always seems to come back with something else, whether it's a horror book, whether it's a crime novel, whether it's you know, just general fiction. He always seems to be a man who has to write, but he has already made his mark on literature, so he will always be remembered as one of the great contemporary American writers of his century. Simply because those books will stay in print, I suspect, forever, or most of those books will stay in print forever. He will leave behind a body of work probably second to none of any other contemporary writer in the 20th and 21st century.
John Coffey, electricity shall now be passed through your body until you are dead, in accordance with state law. May God have mercy on your soul.
The truth is that adaptation is more immediately accessible because you're going from somebody else's template. You're following somebody else's roadmap. You may be redefining the road along the way. You know, you may be finding alternate shortcuts or whatnot. You know, but essentially you're following that author's voice. The very first story that I ever adapted was The Woman in the Room, which was this short story by Stephen King, which I actually did make as a short film back in my early 20s with my friends. I mean, it took us three years to make this 30-minute movie because we had no resources really to speak of. It worked out well enough that Steve King liked it very much. That then led to my acquiring the rights to, some years later, to The Shawshank Redemption. Steve King has this policy of optioning some of his short stories. If he has the rights, he will option these short stories to student filmmakers or young filmmakers, because I wasn't a student at the time, but young filmmakers for $1. It was really that policy, that generosity on his part, that allowed me to really have a directing career. And I never really thought that I would direct a prison movie, much less 2 prison movies. Certainly having done Shawshank, I wasn't looking for another one to do. But Steve sort of subverted this by writing this astonishingly good, character-driven, sort of semi-magical prison story called The Green Mile. And I first heard about it when I was on a phone conversation with Steve, and he said, well, you know, I've been kicking this story around, this story idea. This would be great for you as a director, but I know you're not going to want to do it. I said, well, what is it? He said, you really won't want to do it because it's another prison story. I said, well, you're right. I won't want to do it, but tell me what the idea is. And so he laid the idea down in 30 seconds or less. He kind of told me about the John Coffey character, and being on death row and being sort of touched by a higher power and having this healing power and being mentally a child. And I listened to this and I thought, wow, that sounds really good. That sounds really interesting. So I said, Steve, you're probably right. I probably don't want to do it, but do me a favor. If you write this thing, give me first crack at it. And not that long after that, I got the first volume in the mail, and it was the first published book. There were 6 little slim paperback volumes, and I got the first one, and I read it, and I went, wow, holy hell, this is amazing. And so I decided, based on that first volume, that I was going to make the movie. I was going to commit to make the movie. I hadn't read the remaining 5 volumes of The Green Mile. I had no idea where it was going to go, where he was taking me, and how it was going to end, but I had so much faith in King, based on that first little book, that I said, I'm going to do this. I said to Steve, I love this, I want this, I'm going to make this movie. Can I have the rest of it? And he said, no. You have to wait like everybody else. And that's, you know what? And I did. And looking back on it, I understand why he did that. Well, for one thing, he hadn't actually finished writing the last book yet. But the other thing was, he's like anybody. He wants to present his art to the reader the way he thinks it would be best suited. And he wanted me to experience it just like the readership did, one every month. And so that's exactly how I experienced it.
I'm not going to have any trouble with you, big boy. Can you talk?
Yes, boss. I can talk.
My memory of writing The Green Mile was 3 things. Number 1, endless hours, like every waking moment, truly, at the computer. Listening to an astonishing amount of old jazz, period pre-war jazz. Music can really inform the process of writing a script. You find them, if you sometimes find the musical identity of the script that you're writing, then it helps you find the identity of the script itself. And then the third thing that was my cat was just before I started writing. It turns out he had a tumor. He wasn't in any pain, so I said, let's not put him to sleep. I'll take him home and just care for him. And so the 8 weeks that I spent writing The Green Mile was 8 weeks with my cat, keeping me company, being my co-writer, my co-pilot at the desk, writing The Green Mile. So it's the whole Green Mile death row experience, as Tom Hanks once put it. The writing of it was very much that. I had this creature I really cared about walking that mile. You know, it was really interesting. And indeed, right about the time I finished the script is the time that the cat died. So he spent his last 2 months with me writing The Green Mile. It was really kind of interesting.
You be still, Mr. Jenkins. You be so quiet, so still.
My best writing experiences, and this is common, I think, to writers, were those times when I could completely plug into the Zen flow of the process. It's like you forget yourself, and you're like channeling something from somewhere. The creative process really is a lifelong journey. Sometimes you get luckier than at other times. Sometimes you tap deeper into who you are than at other times. Writing something that's original can be diabolically difficult. That's why I can write something like The Green Mile in 8 weeks. 8 very intense weeks, mind you, but I could do it. And writing an original can take months longer, can take, a year. Depending on how difficult the story is to crack. It's one of the reasons I really like adaptations. I mentioned before the author's voice, maintaining the author's presence in the adaptation. I've always felt very strongly that was job number one for the screenwriter. It is incumbent upon us to maintain that author's voice and try to be as true to that author's tonality as we can. So it's not Stephen King speaking, but it's Frank Darabont doing a good imitation of Stephen King. I try to blend our sensibilities as seamlessly as possible so that when people see the movie, they really feel like they're seeing the same story that they read, and that we hit the same emotional notes that the reader had when he read Steve's story. And from a practical standpoint, the methodology of adapting a novel, that in particular, was as follows. I had a legal yellow pad. And when I went through the books, and I wrote number 1 through number however many, and I wrote down a simple one-line description of every scene in Stephen King's story from beginning to end. And I would look at that sequence, that structural sequence, and say, well, I can do without that, I can do without that. Ooh, I can connect these two. I can make this point down here in a roundabout way, and come from behind rather than the way Steve did it, but we'll get to the same destination. And once I got to that, I'd cross it out and go on to the next thing. And it was very much a focused process because I think I had about 8 weeks before the rights were gone. Now, I know that Steve would have given me a little grace period, of course, because of his generosity, but I didn't want to have to ask. I said, okay, well, I did Shawshank in 8 weeks. I can certainly do this in 8 weeks, and that's exactly what I did.
Take my hand, boss. You see for yourself.
In terms of specific satisfactions in The Green Mile, certainly in writing, I was very excited when I connected the dots on something, because there's late in the story, there's several chapters, like almost half of one of those books, where our main character, Paul, has started to suspect that John Coffey is perhaps innocent of the crime that he's on death row for. Steve King has this character kind of go off on several chapters of investigative stuff. He kind of turns into Sherlock Holmes for a while to kind of put the pieces together of what he suspects is the truth. And it's interesting to read, but I thought at this point in the narrative, having him wander around for 10 minutes on screen and asking questions and getting answers is going to be deadly. So I came up with the idea one day of John Coffey being this psychic conduit, which is part of his character as Steve wrote him. It seemed so apparent to me that if Coffey grabs Paul by the hand and shares this psychic vision with him, shows him what happened, I thought, wow, that could be a pretty thrilling sequence. And it will accomplish what Steve King spent chapters doing. And I was very, very pleased by that. And that's, I guess, part of what I was saying about keeping the author's tone. It took elements of what Steve had given us, and it just sewed them together in a different enough way that it made the point that Steve was originally making.
I have no illusions of immortality, but I will have wished for death long before death finds me.
I mean, Shawshank really presented a narrator voice to me in adaptation. I never really could quite imagine the movie without that. And yet, even though Green Mile was first-person narrative, kind of in the same way, it didn't present that explanatory voice. I didn't feel it was necessary. I didn't feel there was anything there we couldn't achieve with just the actors presenting the scenes. Though there is a little bit of a narrative voice that kicks in at the very end of the movie, It's not that there's really a narrator, but we really needed to hear old Paul's thoughts there at the very end. So there's a scene where he's talking to his friend, telling her how old he is and what this means and that he'll outlive her.
Oh, I've lived to see some amazing things, Ellie. Another century come to pass.
We kind of dissolve flash forwarding in time to after she dies and he has outlived her, but we're still hearing him talking to her from the previous scene, and in that way it does actually turn into narration there at the very end of the movie.
We each owe a death. There are no exceptions. But oh God, sometimes the Green Mile seems so long.
The Green Mile was a tremendous challenge. Technically, tonally, emotionally, it was just a huge, huge challenge. Much greater challenge, really, than Shawshank was. As great a challenge as that was, particularly for being my first film. Green Mile was like climbing a mountain, barefoot. And I'm really proud of the results. I'm really proud of what wound up on screen. It was, for me, just in terms of what was demanded of me as a challenge, really the most satisfying. And also thematically, it's not as clean a package. It's not as nicely tied up, with a bow kind of thematic package as my other films. The Green Mile is just a little bit. There's enough ambiguity in there. To this day, I don't know 100% what the story means. I'm still kind of figuring it out, and that's tremendously satisfying, because if you're going to try to create some kind of art, it shouldn't all be obvious to the artist. There should be an interpretive margin even for the person doing it, because then there will certainly be for the people who are giving themselves over to it and experiencing it. You've touched people, you've touched their emotions, and indeed that is that master heading of storyteller. That is what we're meant to do. We're meant to touch people, however that's defined. Make them laugh, make them cry, whatever that is. Involve them, touch them, stir their emotions, press those buttons, Try to do it well enough that they don't sense the buttons being pressed, or that at least they appreciate the skill with which the buttons are being pressed. It's great. It's really great.
Walking through the door. Sitting down, taking a seat in those parking.
What do I do?
Watch and learn.
Here was this very dark movie with very little visual scope to it. I mean, as far as vistas go. This was essentially a story about E-block, that literally is about a long strip of green linoleum. And yet the story it told was so empowering, spiritually, emotionally. You got so wrapped up in it that it defied a number of the conventions of standard movie making.
It was like playing on a world championship basketball team where everybody knew their roles and nobody was jealous or envious of anybody else.
It just felt like a special thing. There was a special feeling in the air, like we really want to make this good.
It sort of took on a life of its own. There wasn't an opportunity for the energy to dissipate because it was done so much like a theater production.
There really was a real sense of having shared an experience together.
People do say casting is half the battle, and I say casting is all the battle. Obviously, the actors are the conduit through which the story flows. The story lives here, and it always will. And you, as the director, can pull out every flashy camera move you want, and it doesn't matter if it's not here.
Dead man! Dead man walking! Dead man! Dead man walking! Dead man walking here! Dead man!
I've been pretty lucky with my casting, I think. Lightning has been caught in that bottle a few times for me. Certainly The Green Mile was the singular experience I've ever had of Every single actor that was my first choice for the movie said yes and did the movie.
The power of being in this particular ensemble was very unique. I made a number of jobs that were just guy-centric, you know, Apollo 13 and Saving Private Ryan and plenty of others. But I've never had, this is no lie, there's no embellishment here, I've never had the ensemble experience that I had on the Green Mile. There was a bona fide affection for one another. A very disparate group of individuals, but there was some strange coagulation of desires and talents on this thing, where we would come out of our trailers when we weren't in the scene to watch what somebody was doing in the setup that we weren't even in. That's how much we cared about each other's psyches as far as coming to work.
Tom set a very high bar with the work. His work off camera, it was never a notch less. If he was going to do it, he was going to do it fully and truthfully every time.
Well, I think the greatest example of generosity, and it came from our leader in a way, Tom Hanks, was in the scene with Michael when he's deciding what he's going to do. And it's Tom and Michael in the cell, and I'm kind of standing at the door watching. It's a hugely critical scene to the film, and I got to stand there and watch these guys work. And they shot Michael's side of things first, and Tom's off camera for this whole scene. And Tom was just giving him everything, everything. I don't think unless you're an actor, you understand how much that means to have that being given to you from somebody else, how much it helps you as an actor.
The only thing I really tried to copy of Tom was I tried to copy his honesty, because I felt he was so honest in the portrayal. And I thought, well, this would have stayed with the character in his old age. So you only saw the character I played after all this rich experience that Tom facet of the character had played earlier.
Working with him was the pleasure of my directing life. But that trickled down with all the rest of the cast, too. I mean, they were all wonderful people. I think a certain amount of that also keyed off of Tom. We found Michael because I got a call from Bruce Willis. Willis had read these books and called and said, I got the guy who's going to be your John Coffey. You got to read Michael Clark Duncan. You got to have him in to read.
And I walked into Frank's office, and I had been preparing, and I wasn't good. I was almost on the cusp of what they might want to see in John Coffey.
He was okay. He was pretty good, but he was acting. And then off he went, and we started into prep. I kept seeing other actors for it.
When we hired people in North Carolina, we hired a scout down in the southern part of the States, and we had somebody, I believe, in England and Australia. We really kind of did a thorough search.
I kept thinking about Michael because Michael had this essence that lingered after he walked out of the room. And I finally thought, let's get in touch with Michael Clark Duncan, have him in again, but let's give him an acting coach. And that's when we brought Larry Moss in.
Michael Clark Duncan came into my apartment, and I said to him, well, what do they call you? And he said, they call me Big Mike. And I said, well, you can't play this part. And he got a little angry, and he said, what do you mean, Mr. Moss? And I said, only little Mike can play it.
And he told me, he said, John Coffey is 5 years old. He's big in stature, but mentally he's only 5 years old. He said, and if you can't do that, then you're wasting everybody's time.
I said, tell me anything you can remember about growing up in Chicago with your sister and your mother with that kind of poverty. And no matter how painful it is, I want you to tell me. Well, what he told me was so sad and so difficult. But as he told me, he began to get really emotional.
And every audition I went in, I got a little bit better. And Frank just kept looking at me, and sometimes they'd yell cut, and he would just stare at me for like 30 seconds, and he wouldn't say anything, and I would just stare back at him. And I guess that's what he was trying to see. Do I see John Coffey in his eyes? And that's what Larry Moss always taught me. He said, if you don't have it here in your eyes, you'll lose the person.
And then it was time, okay, let's do some screen tests now. Because this is starting to get very interesting. It was kind of down to 3 guys at that point. And I decided to put all 3 of them on film.
On the second take of the second scene, they did a push-in on Michael's face. And in his eyes was the pain of the world. He had found that in himself. And the camera doesn't lie that close.
Michael, by then, had come such a long way as an actor that there was like something magical on screen happening with him. And it became so apparent that this was his role. And then by the time we started filming, Michael had made another quantum leap.
And I remember one particular time I'm doing this very emotional scene. And Larry Moss says, Michael, I have to leave. I remember my father leaving me when I was like 5 or 6 years old. And for some reason, it was almost the exact same way my father left. And he said, Michael, you're gonna be fine. He said, trust me, just remember everything we talked about. And I remember my father saying, hey, grow up to be a strong man, almost the same type of speech. And I'm looking at Larry and I'm seeing my father leave. It was the exact same moment and tears just start flowing down my face. And I could see Frank Darabont over on the side. And I'm looking at Larry Moss and Frank Darabont is telling everybody, let's roll, let's roll. And the emotion was just there. And I was thinking about John Coffey, but mostly I was thinking about Larry Moss just left me. He's been with me for like 3 months. How can he abandon me like this? To this day, I don't know if Larry Moss did that on purpose, that he knew that that would tap into what I told him about my father leaving, or that he really just had to go. But for whatever reason, it worked out. Thank you, Mr. Moss.
The emotional journey that John Coffey had to do was, it would be intimidating for any actor. Somebody with 30 years of experience or someone doing it for the first time. If we were a baseball team, he was the guy that batted cleanup, but he was the rookie phenom that batted cleanup, you know. We needed him and he wanted him badly. And there wasn't a guy on the set who wouldn't do anything in order to help him get there.
If John Coffey doesn't work, if that performance isn't up to snuff, then the whole movie's just gonna go right on its face. That's why finding the right actor, the perfect actor for that was so crucial.
You've been declared competent. You know what that means? That means you're gonna ride the lightning, son. Zap! Just like that.
Well, I think where it really became clear what this ensemble could be was the first read-through we did.
The table reading, as I recall, I think it was powerful because the screenplay was so perfect. I read the screenplay first and then went back and read the 6-part series of novels. And because I was looking for, well, maybe there's got to be something in there that is missed, and I need it for my own research and rounding out the characters. I said, dang, there ain't nothing in that novel that isn't in this screenplay.
You deserve to be punished for what you did today. You accept it like a man will make you sorry you were ever born. We'll tell people how you sabotaged Bill's execution and how you pissed yourself like a frightened little girl. Yes, we'll talk. That's a given.
A lot of times readings can be very tame, you know, and people just kind of bury their face in the book. And then we read it, and Michael, he has to do this scream in the beginning of the film, and he really screamed. And then Michael Jeter went for it, and then I had to come in and explode onto the scene. And so it was just all of a sudden it was like this free-for-all. And so we did this read-through. It was almost like a real performance, you know. People were like really doing the movie at the table.
I remember being somewhat intimidated by the talent, but also really comforted by the group of people. So I was mostly worried about, is Tom going to be doing the accent? You know, I didn't want to sound like I was on Hee Haw. I was just scared. But once we started getting into it, I started to relax and you know, just felt better about it as the moment went on.
Speed. Haley Mark.
I'm in here, I'm occupied.
I can tell you from my perspective as a director what the most important thing is. It's a sense of enthusiasm and commitment and excitement to what we're doing. When you are showing up on the Green Mile set for the 4th month in a row, and we've been on that damn set, 5 days a week, if they can maintain the excitement that they felt when they first read that script, or at least close to it, they can find it in themselves to stay excited.
Frank had his own rhythm, and it was really clear what was happening on film was what was going to make this movie be special.
If there was anything that got hard after a while, it was that there was a mind-numbing sameness to showing up in the same dimly lit place every day and putting on these same uniforms and having to then to get to this very particular emotional pitch that the scene required. Now, the sneaky part about that is it worked perfectly for the story we were telling. We were playing guards who go to the same place every day and try to survive emotionally the course of what our 8-hour shift is going to be. It was acting by doing in a very, very substantial way.
I think because the film was shot almost in continuity, and we grew and bonded so closely as actors throughout the course of filming, that when it came time for one of the characters to be executed, it was like losing an arm. It was like losing a part of our family.
One of the reasons that I dreaded the last day of shooting for myself was because I knew it would go on, and it would go on without me, just like life goes on after you're gone. And I dreaded that day. I was afraid that when I died and when I wrapped, that I would be forgotten. It's difficult to die in a film, especially if you feel close to the people you're working with, you know. You form emotional bonds with people.
Michael was kind of the soul of the cast. You'd think that would be Tom Hanks' role, but it was kind of Michael. I actually remember Tom Hanks crying the night that we wrapped Michael.
Edouard Delacroix, you have been condemned to die by a jury of your peers, sentence imposed by a judge in good standing in this state.
You know, it took so long to shoot Dell's execution. I think it took us a week, really. The extras were just amazing. I mean, extras do not have an easy job. So I had to say these lines, of course, over and over and over because I'm leading the execution. So as a joke, one day, about midweek, I turned to them and I said, I'll give anybody $20 if they can stand up and recite my line verbatim.
Edouard Delacroix, electricity shall not be passed through your body until you're dead. In accordance with the state law, God have mercy on your soul.
What I didn't know was that Hanks wrote on huge cards in big letters my entire speech. And when we first started the contest, he was holding up the cue cards behind me. And I wouldn't have caught it if the extras hadn't been laughing.
What was it? Judges are sorry. You actually added the.
Yes, a few people finally did recite it, so I was out like $60 or something like that, but it was well worth the fun and time we had doing it. It made it like a party a little bit instead of this grueling sort of thing.
Ready? And action! Hey! You love your sister? You making a noise, you know what happens? I'm gonna kill her instead of you. If you making a noise, I'm gonna kill her.
The two girls liked me. They were following me around all day, and I had befriended them, you know, so I wanted them to trust me, and, you know. And then I'd go right into this close-up with the two girls, and I said, you know, I'm gonna kill her if you don't, you know, I did the line, and one of the girls started crying, you know, and we'd been having fun the whole day. I felt really bad. I felt really bad about it. But it just goes to show you that, I mean, it does get a little intense, you know. Sometimes when you got to do these things, they get a little realistic in a way that can be not so fun.
What's your name?
John Coffee Man. Like to drink. Only not spelled the same.
Every day, you know, that I was on that set was a journey. For me, and don't it was like walking into hell, because I'd get into that room and, you know, I was in this prosthetic, and I think Michael knew the journey I was on, I knew the journey he was on, and we were just tuned in to one another.
Frank not only cast it well, but he creates an atmosphere in which actors can really do their best work. I had a sort of an interesting journey. I thought, wow, I got this great scene with Tom, and I worked on that scene from the time I got the script. I was making Babe 2 in Australia, so I worked on it basically for about 5 or 6 months. What I wanted to have happen, which is I wanted to break on camera, full face, as the weight of what I thought was happening to him fell upon him. And I got on set and went to do it, and it was totally dry. I was dry as a bone, could not get this thing. Then when I did the scene where she is cured and she opened her eyes, I broke all day long. I hadn't paid any attention to that scene at all. And I found then what I had done wrong with the first scene. I thought the scene was about the pain that he was feeling that his wife was going to die of cancer. But in actual fact, it was a scene in which he asks his best friend, how do I tell my wife that what she has is inoperable cancer? If I had simply done that task, then a weight of the whole of the experience would have, I think, given me the result I wanted.
Please, boss. Don't put that thing over my face. Don't put me in the dark. I was afraid of the dark.
My theory is that everybody who works on movies lives for that experience of having been part of a film that they wind up being extremely proud of.
It is one of those unusual movies where there are so many moments that I could point to. And it's really been confirmed over the years how special this movie is by the numbers of people who have told me how much this movie means to them.
To do something that you deeply care about and that has the potential of moving people away from their positions and thereby transforming the culture that we live in. You know, the only thing that makes us human, as far as I'm concerned, is the stories we tell each other. So I rather loved that this one was hopeful and bittersweet and complicated, not easy, thought-provoking, deeply spiritual, transformative.
I was astounded at the power of the movie. I thought that it achieved everything that was unique about the script and special about the working atmosphere with the ensemble. And the stuff that I saw that I wasn't in, for example, the stuff with Dabs, was beautiful. I had the same reaction I did when I was seeing the movie as I did when I finished reading the novel, is that this is very Spartan. It's not dense, it's not thick, but it is so sophisticated and it's so emotional that it's this odd kind of like Stephen King, Frank Darabont 2.5-hour haiku to what prison life is like on death row, and it's extraordinary.
The Green Mile put Michael Clarke Duncan on the map as an actor. Like I said, I only had one movie before that, and that was Armageddon. And once The Green Mile came out, that was my biggest acting role to that date. So that everything else came because of The Green Mile. It came because of the brilliant script by Frank Darabont. It came because of Stephen King, from Tom Hanks to David Morse to Sam Rockwell, Doug Hutchison, Patricia Clarkson, Bonnie Hunt, Jeffrey DeMunn. Everybody had a piece of that in me. It was no individual thing. I could care less about being nominated. I would have given up that nomination for us to win Best Picture. I really wanted that. But that being said, you can never get that back in time. In 100 years from now, when people are going through old movies, they will pull up The Green Mile, and that is a part of cinematic history, and we are a part of that history.
You know you're going to trap the audience there because most of the film takes place on the mile.
To actually walk on the Green Mile, it's like being inside the country of my own imagination.
There is a very important relationship that needs to develop really between the production designer and the cinematographer, and the costume designer and the cinematographer and the production designer, you know, because those three areas do walk very much hand in hand, and the cinematographer certainly needs to know the intention of what the production designer, costume designer are trying to bring him, and bring me, and bring the movie.
Terry March, genius production designer, right here, the man responsible.
For Shawshank, my producer Nikki had set up a lot of meetings with various production designers. Next guy in, Terrence Marsh. Lawrence of Arabia is the guy's first credit as a young art director, and I went, you've got to be kidding me. What is he talking to me for? And I just fell in love with him, right away. And I knew that I would benefit from his level of experience.
I was very impressed with him, one, because he was so young, and two, because the script was so good. And in fact, one of the best scripts I'd read.
Very honored to work with Terry for 2 films. Talking about a man who himself has left a legacy of great work and extraordinary artistry. David Tattersall is a very empathetic and conciliatory cinematographer. He wants to try and help everybody do their best job. Tattersall and I were quite concerned about trying to just subtly give different shadings to every scene.
There's always a temptation to maybe sugarcoat it a little bit. Photographically, one could add filters and keep everybody in backlights, give it the Hollywood treatment. But we chose to make it probably a little bit more believable, a bit more down to earth.
Once you have the Depression era to work with in Green Mile, that starts to suggest, certain avenues.
Oh, that was great.
I had tremendously good connective tissue with Karen Wagner, who was doing costumes.
There's a tremendous amount of detail that goes into period because you're constantly trying to explain by these tiny little sort of clues that give you an intimation of what was going on in the period without there being any narrative about it.
No, I'm just afraid of them.
There was a lot of historical research that had been done on prisons of the time. Everything was recreated exactly the way it was. Little things that most people would kind of take for granted, from the keys that went into the cells to the locks to the bars.
The uniforms were nerve-wracking, I think, because they had to be so specific and they had to be so perfect. Every little detail had to be so perfect about them because we were going to be looking at them for so long. For me, it was much more about Terrence's set than it was about my costumes.
To find a house still in its 1930s condition, surrounded by 1930s environs, very difficult. We actually had to do work on all 3 of them to sort of take them down from the 90s, as it were, back to the 30s. In fact, Gary Sinase's house, we built a complete porch at the back, over his porch, which wasn't suitable, put a false front on that and built a whole new porch. And the warden's house was a cracker. That was a great house. That was a house built as a kit, sent out from the East Coast. And there was this Victorian house, and they screwed it together on this spot, and it's still standing there. Another very difficult house to find was the house of the 2 small girls' family, because we wanted a dramatic house where these, things happened. And we finally found this gorgeous old house, run down, and it had this magnificent tree, and it was up on a rise, and was terrific.
When I was scouting for Shawshank, trying to find a really great, photogenic, old empty prison, we went to scout one in Mansfield, Ohio, and one just on the outskirts of Nashville, Tennessee.
Once again, we went trailing round prisons looking for a suitable exterior location. Funnily enough, the one we settled on for the Green Mile in Nashville was our second choice for Shawshank. We scouted it those years before and thought, this is pretty good.
It had more the fantasy kind of look to it, a sort of a fantasy element to the design, which I thought was appropriate for the Green Mile, given that there's this sort of whimsical fantasy element to it, with the John Coffey character and the healing and Mr. Jingles, etc.
And we built on location as well. The actual exterior of the E block was built in a yard over an existing tool shed in Nashville. The interiors don't quite match up to what we'd hoped to do, so we have to find a way of transition from there into our studio stuff.
Terrence built every single interior that we had, with one tiny exception, the warden's office.
Terry's department, the art department, they did an amazing job, you know, particularly the painters and the plasterers and the set dressing, all the little details that helped to make it a very real environment.
How's this for a set? I love this.
What is the Green Mile? The Green Mile is the corridor leading to Old Sparky and the prison that was a special kind of linoleum. Frank would anguish over the right color, the right texture, the right everything.
I kind of had this color in my head. Steve described it so nicely.
Stephen King, I think, used the line, the color of faded limes. Well, that's a tricky color. What is the color of faded limes? You know, your idea probably different to mine.
Terrence Marsh searched high and low for that particular green shade of linoleum. You didn't want it too light, you didn't want it too dark, you wanted just that sort of perfect, sort of bilious, smarmy kind of green color.
It was a question of finding a lino, or linoleum, as it's called really, that was sufficiently period-looking that we could make the color of faded limes. We found a sort of black and white grey thing which we washed with color like limes until we finally got the look right.
Laying that stuff down was, well, it's like putting the perfect hairstyle on your lead actress. You know, you can't have the Green Mile without that perfect green linoleum flooring.
We got the stuff down, and I think the first day of shooting, the grips laid a track and screwed right through the lino into the plywood underneath, you know, for the track.
And suddenly I'm hearing zzz, zzz, and I turn around and I went, ah, just like in a Tex Avery cartoon. Like my eyes went, wowga! And I said, guys, you got to treat the floor. We're going to be here for months. We're going to be on this floor for 3 months. You can't just start punching it full of holes and scratching the hell out of it, because it's just going to become ultra trash during the course of filming if we don't take care of it.
The grips didn't do that anymore. That was the last time that happened. We used sandbags or something more sensible next time. Not that I'm complaining about grips, because they probably just didn't think about 3 weeks on when the second unit were trying to get a mouse to run across it.
Andy's working his magic.
It wound up being a bit of an effort to maintain the flooring of the Green Mile, because we couldn't replace that damn floor every time we had scratches in it.
And then we had the added problem, because we had the crew, we had the actors working on the same space for weeks on end, that it was changing color. So then, you know, there was a constantly resurfacing it.
After a while, I didn't even let people walk onto the mile unless they had these like surgical booties, these little blue surgical booties that you'd see in an operating room. And everybody would have to put those on to walk around on the mile, because I just knew if I let the grips have their way, that floor would have been unshootable within a week. So, yeah, it was kind of nuts looking back on it.
We did stick to Stephen's basic description of the geography.
You know, we went from the cell area to the office area, and then we had, you know, the electrocution. Old Sparky was there in the back.
And if you remember, if you walked down the Green Mile, right was out to the fresh air, and left was down that little corridor and into the death house.
Walk in the mile, walk in the mile, walk in the Green Mile.
I remember reading Stephen's book, and it was very macabre the way the place in which they executed these guys was like a general purpose shed where they kept kerosene for the lamps, they kept toilet paper, and they kept gardening implements. And then to execute someone, they cleared the stuff out, set up the electric chair, brought the people in, and then fried them, you know. And I thought, that's really terrible to sort of end your life in the sort of back shed of somewhere. And we tried to get that feeling. I think we put an old tractor and various other things in there, and the electric chair, of course, which was that was a production on its own, the electric chair.
Check this out, man.
We saw a lot of electric chairs in various places. And then we did a few scribbles of like this, like that, like that. Should his arms be clamped? Should they be strapped? Should his legs be clamped? should the, you know, the helmet was quite a thing, making that helmet, you know, just right. It's, I don't think an audience realizes, you know, they take this electric chair, that's it, how much talk and planning and work and craftsmanship goes into making that stuff.
How historically accurate is this?
Actually, this incorporates features from about 3 or 4 different electric chairs that were the most interesting features.
I thought the chair was a character of the film. You know, and I think every time we had a scene in the execution room, we tried to make it look different every time. Yeah, so shooting from different angles or lighting it in a different way. And most of the more dramatic scenes took place in the execution room. You know, the 2 main execution scenes themselves are high points in the script, visually.
Thank God it's only a movie. It's creepy, huh?
Yeah, oh yeah.
This is a story about the electric chair and about the early days of the electric chair and about the days when capital punishment was the rule rather than the exception in the United States. And it sends a chill down your spine when you see it sitting there in its own little pool of light. It looks so bare and spare. There's no joke about it. There's no little grace notes to it. It's just an appliance. Its job is not to fry toast or fry eggs, but to fry human beings' asses, you know? And of course, I did what anybody wants to do when they see it. I said, strap me in it. And once you get in it, you say to yourself, oh boy, this is like being too far in my own head.
I'm fine! I'm a done Tom Turkey!
You know, I'm very proud of that film because it looks, I have to say that it looks very natural. It doesn't look designed. It doesn't look composed. It doesn't look like all that hard work into it.
I thought it was every bit as good as Shawshank, and I thought it would be nominated, which it was, which I was delighted for Frank.
People went to insane lengths to create something that felt incredibly authentic to the period. Not just authentic, but interesting and authentic. You want people like that because that matches my level of madness and obsession.
Look what else he found. You never believe this. Individual income tax return.
1935. It's a pleasure and an inspiration to work with collaborators like that, you know, colleagues like that who care so much, you know, who like gone to insane lengths to get this, you know, napkin holder from 1935 because this is going to make the movie better, you know. This is going to help add to the patina of texture and authenticity that we're trying to convey on screen. I love that. That's just awesome.
Frank's vision was vivid on the page, and you immediately got a sense of what it looked like.
And that comes from being a great storyteller because it's part of what he does.
But the movie does definitely have more effects than the audience realizes watching it. Extremely proud, really, of the film visually, and in terms of solving the problems, addressing the challenges and meeting them. I call it doing math. It's like, well, how are we going to do this? How are we going to make Michael Clark Duncan look 9 inches taller than he is, you know, so that he's John Coffey and not the actor playing him? How are we going to do the bugs or ashes or whatever those are that fly out of his mouth?
Do we use makeup? Do we use another actor? Nobody knows.
Who's going to play that Tom Hanks character, old, in those bookends, that opening of the movie and the closing of the movie, that take place contemporarily? Who's going to play that? Is it actually going to be Tom Hanks? Is it going to be another actor?
There's a way of thinking that would say, well, you take a young actor, you put him in old age makeup. And that could work if he's an old actor in an old age makeup sitting in a room all by himself.
I went to 2 of the best makeup artists in the world to do makeup tests on Tom, and one of them was Rick Baker, who did really a fantastic makeup. And then Greg Nicotero, my dear friend, also, he tried his version of it, which was also very, very good.
The concept, we used gelatin, and the idea was that we gave him just a little bit of a hairpiece along the back because we wanted him to be bald. We just wanted to just kind of make him still feel like Tom Hanks, but look different.
Old age makeup test.
And action.
Frank was anxious to do a lot of tests, and we did 2 huge days of all-day makeup tests, because it takes about 6 hours to get into that stuff. And we did 2 different versions of it, and on a still photograph, it looked fantastic. And if I was sitting in a chair all by myself, it looked fantastic. But as soon as you brought in the real actors, or put me in a rest home with a bunch of other folks, it was just the authenticity and the credibility of the film was going to be leached right out.
I could really sense disaster looming, because sometimes the makeup would look perfect like this, but if you turn this, like just even this much, suddenly the light hits it a different way, and suddenly it looks like plastic. And all this amazing work that these makeup artists have done is suddenly betrayed, simply because it needs to be versatile.
There it went. Just lost it.
Let's cut it.
All right.
I just did not want the audience staring at the old age makeup, because then they're out of the story. They're gone. It's not the Green Mile they're watching Tom's old age makeup. And it doesn't matter how good everything else is.
When he found Abs Greer, and we met for the first time, I think that he felt confident enough in order to go that direction. Because look, he's the filmmaker, it's a bold choice. He doesn't know if he can go off and find a guy to play old Paul Edgecombe. And so when he did, I mean, it was an amazing shuffle of the deck. We couldn't imagine doing it any other way. Geez, he was Paul Edgecombe as much as I was.
Still to this day, am much more comfortable with that decision than if I'd gone the old age makeup route.
Right now, I want to hear about this new inmate. Aside from how big he is, okay? Monstrous big.
What I really love are the invisible effects, when you've completely fooled the audience's eye. What was particularly fun was making Michael Clark Duncan appear to be 9 inches taller than he is throughout the movie.
John Coffey, I can't recall, but I think in Stephen's book he was written as 7 feet tall. He was a giant. He was an anomaly. He was a guy who would have stood out today. Michael was not as tall as we would have liked.
So they said, you're 6'5", so we at least need 6 or 7 inches. So they start looking around and they say, stand up on those apple boxes. And I stood up on one of the giant apple boxes, and they were like, that's perfect. I said, well, let's make him something that he has to walk on the whole movie. So they made the apple box, they painted them green. I have a big section of it at home.
There was a number of things that Frank would ask for and that we were able to do for him, which, I mean, his bed in the cell was smaller when they first bring him to prison, and he gets out of the paddy wagon that's bringing him in. We redid the suspension on that with a hydraulic system so that it starts out low, and then as he leaves it, then it springs back up.
The scene where we find Michael Clark Duncan cradling the 2 dead girls was a really, really challenging scene.
Greg Nicotero and K&B made the 2 little dead girls for me because I was worried about traumatizing two little real girls who were playing these roles. You know, for casting up these girls and making basically duplicates of them, let's shrink them a little bit. Let's do 7/8 scale.
The idea was when you see him sitting there cradling them, sobbing, that the girls look tiny and frail and small in his frame.
We did the same thing with the electric chair. We had 3 electric chairs. We had the hero chair that everybody sat in. We had the effects chair that was the Delacroix dummy that burst into flames, which needed to have cables running through it and everything. And then we had John Coffey's chair. And the difference was John Coffey's chair was 7/8 scale. So when Michael Clark Duncan sat in it, he really looked huge. He looked massive in that thing.
Edouard Delacroix, you have been condemned to die by a jury of your peers.
That sequence, the execution of Delacroix, is a fantastic example of the collaborative nature of film. First of all, Michael Jeter's performance. And Michael, did an amazing job. At a certain point, we had to go from Michael Jeter, the actor, performing this, we had to go to an articulated dummy.
Okay, now in this scene, I want you to burst into flames.
So we had Michael Jeter sit in the chair with Frank, and we said, well, Frank, show me what the action is going to be. Let's see what you intend on seeing out of his performance, and then we'll take that information and build our dummy accordingly. We created an entire fiberglass body because we didn't want it to be able to burn, and it had all these cables that would not only make the wrists move, but also make the body fling forward and the head move, and the legs were able to move.
It was seamless. It was kind of scary to all of a sudden turn around and look at yourself, you know, life size. And I thought they did a great job on all the puppet stuff, on the articulation of the puppet, you know, for the electrocution.
Then there's Daryl Pritchett, who is our physical effects supervisor.
They came up with this great dummy that was set up in the chair so that it would be able to be manipulated and made to move during the execution. And my part of the whole thing was to come up with the flame and the smoke and the fire and all of that, and make that work to Frank's satisfaction. Lots of smoke, blue flame. We have 9 different things that'll go off on the body. Ready? Absolutely good.
Daryl had concocted this stuff that would be the flames shooting out of Michael Jeter. So now you bring that into the equation as well.
And now head. Whoa! Holy moly.
We were very specific about the color of the flame that we wanted, because there's a certain, anytime you deal with blue flame, it always feels more electrical than red flame. Psychologically, it feels like it's not just a hot flame from a match, it's actually electrical. The blue flame and getting it to work within the wardrobe and getting it to all, I think that the end result worked out quite well.
Yes, boss. Yes, Mr. Darabont.
Good work, guys.
Let's do it again.
There's one shot particularly in the film that blows my mind for what they were able to do.
It was, I think, the second shot of the bugs coming from John Coffey.
We have a shot where the camera's kind of in the cell, over the sill, and the camera rises up out over the mile as all these sort of bug-like things kind of swirl out onto the mile, and the 4 guys, Tom and the other guys, are staring up, watching these things disappear. We had a problem with one of the takes, which is that when we started off on John, Michael Clark Duncan, the head of the shot was completely out of focus. The problem with the other take, the guys were looking in the wrong place.
We were able to blend those into one shot to make it feel like a single shot.
And you can't tell that is a seamless blend of literally 2 different shots. It all looks like one smooth shot. And it's really funny. At one moment of this take, you can still see Michael's head from one take, and you're seeing his feet down below the sill. That's Michael from another take. So we got Michael from 2 different takes.
I know Frank had never done anything like that before, and it's somewhat commonplace now to use digital tools to tweak shots, but he was very pleased that we were able to do that.
I would be cautioning you not to get too beefy on the smoke effect, too chunky, especially when we see a lot of them turning into wisps of smoke.
We were a little worried about the bugs. We'll call them bugs because we don't actually know what they are, the things that John Coffey coughs up after he heals somebody. We wanted to make them look a little ambiguous. The audience would be watching them and saying, what the hell are those? Are those bugs? Are they cinders? What the hell is that?
The bugs were very much as described in Frank's script, which turned out to be very much as described in the books. And Stephen King had really laid out a very specific sort of look and evolution to the bugs, the way they appeared, the way they swarmed, the way they disappeared. And I think Frank really liked it. It was so well defined even on the page that we had a great head start. There was a lot of trial and error with how bug-like they were. We finally settled on geometric shapes that one could read as bugs with wings, but they were more simplified than that, and not every single one of them would actually flap and flutter like a bug would.
He swallows the mouse, then spits out a bunch of bugs.
Exactly.
They patterned their movements after fish moving or insects swarming, so that there was sort of this almost school-like behavior you know, kind of flowing, but not quite that specific, you know. And it was great. I was so thrilled when I started seeing those effects come to fruition, because you do see a lot of intermediate stages where it's just not looking good yet.
If you had the anomalous ones happening right off the get-go rather than that spread, the computer just kind of kicks it out in a very even spread, and the less even it is, the more real it looks.
And it took a long time to get the look and the dynamics of this cloud of bugs to feel realistic, but also feel fantastic enough for sort of their purpose in the story.
That's right. All these bugs.
There were some tense times early on. Frank wasn't very happy with the way they looked at first, and we were able to sort of, you know, swim upstream and, you know, get them in shape. But we definitely scared them with our early tests. Things were looking kind of clunky and like flying marbles and, you know, things like that. And he was not too happy at first, but finally we settled on this look.
Recently, I got an award, and they were showing a clip of the Green Mile, and they showed the clip when Percy stomps on Mr. Jingles.
Well, I knew I'd get him sooner or later. It's just a matter of time, really.
And to this day, it just still brings a collective gasp, you know, and people say, how did you do that? How did you do that?
That was probably our favorite scene in a lot of ways, because it's totally seamless, and if you look on the DVD, you can step through frame by frame, and it's absolutely impossible to see where we switched. But the way we did that shot was we had a stuffed mouse that was made out of rubber, you know, with fur on it, and we used motion control to shoot a plate of the real mouse and then Percy's foot stomping down. And just at the point where the real mouse and Percy's foot met in space, we just substituted in on that very frame this rubber mouse and carefully matched its position, the position of its tail, and then reran the motion control move and basically just did an edit, you know, right at the point where the foot contacted the mouse, and it's just absolutely perfect. It's just one of those things that works so well because it's, you know, it's really Percy's foot and he's really stepping on something and there's really a mouse involved. But it's, you know, and it always got the biggest reaction with the audience, you know, because it's, you know, you just don't want it to happen, and you see it happen and you can't believe it, but it just all happens before your eyes. There's no cutting away, it's all in one shot.
Kind of flip us back and forth from the one quarter to the other.
Wow.
That's not bad, is it?
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
You try to apply all your craft and wily skills, if you can, and use your instincts as best you can to create those illusions and those welcome lies for the audience, because they want to be lied to convincingly. You know, it's all lies, really. They want to be told a story. They know it's all made up, but do it well, and they love you for that.
He's smart, Mr. Jingles.
Mr. Jingles.
That his name, he was put in my ear.
It's actually kind of pleasant to hold a little mouse and put him up on your shoulder and let him stay there.
A mouse can do as much for you as an actor. They're just so darn cute.
The mice, Mr. Jingles, wonderful, brilliant. I would work with animals again.
Mr. Jingles totally freaked me out at first, because how do you get a mouse to do what the story is asking the mouse to do? But luckily I had Gunnar, who was our animal trainer.
I got a call from Frank Darabont, and he was talking about doing the Green Mile, and in the Green Mile, there's a mouse. Frank had certain ideas of what he wanted Mr. Jingles to look like. He wanted it to be a little field mouse that somehow you would believe had gotten into the prison. We spent months breeding mice to get the color that he wanted.
We gave them enough prep time. They had like 8 weeks or 9 weeks to get these mice going. Thank God the gestation period for mice is fairly brief.
Mr. Jingles.
We didn't know how we're gonna create this old mouse.
We actually did mouse makeup tests, which proved to be ridiculous. Well, I just said, guys, find me another breed of mouse that's gray. You know?
Boone rubbed some baking soda into the mouse's fur and kind of backcombed it, so it was all sort of puffy and sort of moth-eaten. It really worked well.
Look, I done tamed that mouse.
Some of the difficulties in some of the behaviors that we had to do in the movie was obviously, one is just trying to figure out how to do them, because nobody had ever done them before. Well, fortunately, we had worked on a couple of other movies where we had done some things like that, not quite this extensive, so we had an idea of what to do.
We have about 15 working mice up here, so we have a lot.
So everybody thought we had one mouse doing everything. We had so many different mice. They all did something specific.
When Michael was working with the mouse, the one mouse that runs up his arm and down his hand and runs up there, that's one mouse. The mouse that pushes the spool, the mouse that runs in and stops at his feet, the mouse that eats the crumb, the mouse that runs down the mouth. All those are different mice that were bred to match each other. And Carrie has a mouse here, and she starts showing him where his mark is. And we use a bigger piece of mark to start off with. And we get this smaller and smaller, and pretty soon we can just eliminate the mark because he's going to understand that that's where we want him to stop. So this is just a little bit of the training. As you can see, it goes up, and he'll learn that that's his spot. She just lets him know, and she rewards him by picking him up. Sometimes it's a little food reward, but very seldom is that the case. It's a matter of patterning, letting them know that that's the spot you want them to go, and that's kind of what we're doing here. We had 4 trainers on this thing throughout the movie that really made this happen.
So first what we do is we just pattern him, we show him where his end point is, which is in the bowl, and then we just slowly move him back into the pattern that we want them to run. And so he always knows to go to the red bowl, because that's where his safe place is.
One of the witnesses showed up a day early.
If you look at the movie, there are these close-ups and things that the mouse is doing. I mean, cumulatively, it's an enormous amount of mouse footage you need to get. And you can't really give direction to a mouse, so there's a lot of trial and error. And if I had to shoot it in addition to, you know, the rest of the movie, well, we'd still be there, I'm thinking. So Charlie had his little crew, his little second unit crew, and they were doing all that painstaking work.
Frank brought me on as the visual effects supervisor, ostensibly to handle the mouse effects and also the John Coffey healing effects, but I was also able to direct second unit on the film.
I had drawn storyboards with P. Charlie and I and Boone, and you know, you go over those things painstakingly so they know exactly what they need to get.
There's really nothing that's left up to chance when you're doing any kind of animal training, especially for animals like mice.
I need to go from the shot that reveals him. I need to be able to go to either the Percy or to the mouse.
So basically reversing him neutral.
Neutral.
All right, guys. Under camera, kind of.
Exactly.
A lot of times we were watching a laser pointer dot, you know, where Mr. Jingles was going to be.
I had this little laser pointer pen, so I would give the guys in the scene an eye line. The little red dot on the floor would be Mr. Jingles. Well, once Charlie saw how that was blocked and everything, we figured out the coverage that we needed of the mouse itself.
When you're working with a visual effects person, they look at things different than you do. So therefore, he brings a lot to the table that helps me.
We used a number of camera tricks to kind of help things along. We used a lot of special rigs to get the lens very low to the ground. Our material that we shot had to always look and feel as rich as the rest of the movie. It couldn't feel, you know, inserty or like a nature film, so it had to have that kind of depth and softness that the live action photography had. It ended up really boiling down to skillful camera work and shooting a lot of footage.
That mouse unit was busy. You know, they'd have another set, like right over there. You'd walk by and they'd be in there trying to make this little mouse do the right thing. Oh, God, cranking away the camera, you know. Yep, no, try him again. Laying down the little path for him to follow and filming him.
We were using highly trained, specialized mice to create our impression of natural mouse behavior, which actually isn't really what you want to see. Real mice are very twitchy and kind of bug-like, and they zip around and they don't stand still. And it's not something that's really pleasant to watch on the big screen. So a lot of our work was just sort of calming it down through frame rate and through camera and through visual effects when necessary, and create something that the audience could just sort of relate to more than they would a real mouse.
So bring your prism lens in, boys, and let's get a mouse on film.
Correct, so yeah, I'm the governor's office now.
Yeah.
Well, this is actually our first shot in the movie, so what's going to happen is the mouse appears on the mile for the first time, and he's going to go under camera and go out, and the camera's going to pan up, and we see our lead actors for the first time with the mouse.
And action. Slated. I thought that was pretty sensational, actually.
Oh, he was checking the cells.
Yeah.
Very long.
That
was a cell check.
Yeah.
How do we get the mouse to roll the spool? You try to come up with solutions to those challenges. And if you have people who are as brilliant as Charlie and Boone, you can put all your heads together and come up with those solutions. I will then spill the beans on how you get a mouse to roll a spool, because it's actually such a simple trick. Not possible without the aid of computers. Thank God these tools were invented in filmmaking, because it's such an enormous advantage. What we had there was not just a wooden spool, it was also this whole, it's like a dolly rig, you know, it was like this thing on wheels. And it had a little steel arm that went into the spool. And so if you roll that dolly along, then the spool would roll, right? So somebody could actually operate that. And then what you do with a mouse to get it to go from point A to point B is you let it walk that path a few times. It leaves a little scent trail of itself, and it tends to follow that scent trail. That's what mice naturally do. So they'd have the mouse go over the spool a few times, and then they'd let the mouse go during a take to try to go over that spool. And right when the mouse got to the spool, they'd start rolling it on this little dolly rig. And the mouse is trying to get over the spool and doesn't know what's going on, and kind of just walks along with the spool for a few seconds, and you get the footage.
That's great. That's great. Fantastic.
And then, with computers, you erase the rig that's attached to the spool. What you're left with is a spool rolling, a mouse going like this, and it looks like the mouse is rolling the spool. That is how we got the mouse to roll the spool in the Green Mile. I finally spilled it.
Edgecombe gives me the mouse. The mouse peed in my hand. And I told her, I said, hey, he wet my hand. She said, oh, he loves you. She said, that means that they really feel good around you. Actually, all the little mice, we had like 20 of them. All of them like peed in my hand, which I was very, very proud of, because I think I relate to animals on that level.
All right. Let's go get the damn mouse.
Well, Mr. Jingles was a fan of mine, and I was a fan of his, so I had no problems with the mouse. Now, some of us had a problem with the mouse.
It's a goddamn mouse.
Yeah.
They were nasty little critters. I had the scene where Michael Jeter they were practicing his execution, and we were letting him perform. And my biggest memory is how much that mouse crapped all over him. You know, that's what it did. That's what all those mice did, and you had to constantly be cleaning it up.
Mice pee and poo everywhere they go, and they think they do it about every 3 minutes. So yes, he pooped in the hand, he pooped on the shirt, he pooped in rehearsal, he pooped during the shot. Mice poop a lot, but it's only a tiny little poop. It's not that big deal. And hey, he's part of the ensemble. He gets to do whatever he needs to do.
So? Oh, I love Mr. Jingles. They laugh over there, they cheer, they clap their hands.
Michael Jeter was really helpful. He wanted to really have a connection with that mouse, because that mouse was his whole life when he was in prison. That was kind of like his little escape from his prison cell, was this Mr. Jingles.
He started working with the mice right away, and the entire time he would work with them. If he was on camera or not working that day, he would practice the tricks with all of them.
So people like Michael, that you love working with in the business, that want themselves to look good and want that animal to look like it belongs to him and not to us off camera. So he was a great help.
Michael Jeter took delight in all the work that he had to do with Mr. Jingles.
The unique thing about working with the mice in this particular film was that it gave him something through which he could deny the coming inevitability of his own end. It was in his day-to-day relationship with this little mouse. The mouse was love. Love. That's all.
To see him with those mice was as much what the heart of that film was about as anything else.
Monsieur et Madame, bienvenue au Cirque de Mousy.
Is Jingles just a mouse? Is he some mystical creature? What is Mr. Jingles exactly? The mouse becomes, for that person, what that person needs in order to find their true self. Whether it's a path of hatred and loathing from Percy, or whether it's a path of love and acceptance and ultimate letting go of life, like Delacroix. This innocuous, almost whimsical component of this story winds up being a potent button pusher for character and plot in The Green Mile. And when you really stop and think about that, it's kind of genius storytelling, isn't it? Credit to Steve King.
Steve King thought he could stump us. But he didn't count on you guys.
Roving anglers.
Yeah, mouse rolling a spool. God, how did he dream that up? Good work, everybody.